Well, it's my pleasure to be with you today and my honor to be asked to moderate a panel on the situation in Ukraine, a topic that is on all of our minds right now. And I'm pleased to be joined on the stage by Ambassador Paula Dobrianksy, who is former Undersecretary of State for Global Affairs, a senior fellow at the Harvard University Belford Center, and also a CSPC trustee. Dr. María Herrera, Gatton Professor of Economics here at the University of Kentucky, and by Dr. Robert Farley, a senior lecturer at the Patterson School of Diplomacy and International Commerce, also here at the University of Kentucky. Thank you all for being here for this discussion today. The situation in Ukraine is very much on our minds. I think many of us were shocked, some more surprised than others, at the February 24th invasion by Russian forces of Ukraine at the order of Vladimir Putin. We've all been shocked by the images of attacks on civilian infrastructure, now evidence surfacing of atrocities being committed against Ukrainian citizens. I think we've also been struck at the world's response. In many ways, particularly the economic sanctions, the new set of economic sanctions that have been brought to bear on Russia in ways that 6 weeks ago seemed almost impossible and are unprecedented in many ways. And we've also been struck by the will of the Ukrainian people to resist this invasion. Let me start with a question for Ambassador Dobrianksy. You have a great deal of experience with both international and international conflict. How long do you see this conflict playing out, given that both Vladimir Putin seems to be extremely dug in on this idea of destabilizing or cutting off a piece of Ukraine, and at the same time the Ukrainian people have shown a very strong zeal and willingness to prevent that outcome? How long do you see this playing out?
All right, well, let me answer, but first, congratulations to Concordia, and not only Concordia, but to Lexington. This is my first time here, and I just want to say I'm very proud and pleased to be here in Kentucky and Lexington, and just congratulations on a really fabulous forum. They're going to be there this is going to go on for quite a while. In fact, General Milley, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, just testified the other day. He was asked that very question. He, as a military man, said he does not see any kind of pulling back here, that this could go on not only months, but he even used the word years. What's happening now with this withdrawal from Kiev and also from Chernihiv, they're actually resupplying, regrouping, because we saw the Russian military has not been successful at all, and that's been an eye-opener in this war on Ukraine. I'll add an added note, diplomacy. The thought would be, well, can diplomacy actually bring this down and shorten the time frame? And the answer to that is not really, because the terms that have also been put forward, in my view, by the Russians have been rather unacceptable. They call for the complete demilitarization of Ukraine. I find it very hard to believe that Ukraine will demilitarize, especially after they gave up their nuclear weapons in return for protection of the territorial integrity and sovereignty, and see what happened in that case. They've also been told to not go forward with NATO. President Zelensky has said that he would be neutral and that he wouldn't go forward with NATO enlargement, but that isn't what the Russians have asked for. They've asked to have no NATO enlargement codified in the Ukrainian constitution. And then finally, Russia wants Crimea, and what Russia wants recognition of the quote-unquote independent states of Luhansk and Donetsk, which Ukraine sees both areas actually as part of Ukraine. So diplomatically, I don't see it moving, and then militarily, I think you're seeing a regrouping, but also quite a bit of bombing and a continuation of the goal and the objective of trying to win on the battlefield, which Russia has not been winning.
What are some of the broader implications, kind of the key implications that you've observed coming out of this conflict now, assuming that it is going to last a long time. How do you see it playing out?
Well, there have been a number of implications. First, and also surprises. First, let me say that I think that President Putin miscalculated. I think he calculated and expected there to be a weak Western response. And in this case, actually, I would say, although it's varied and by country, I'd say there's been a rather strong consensus and outrage in what is happening in terms of the scale and the scope of the loss of life and the brutality of this war that's shared by both the United States and also our Western alliance as well as partners. I'd also add that I think that there were those who also underestimated the Ukrainian militarily. And in this case, when supplied, and they should be supplied with the kind of military armament that they could use to carry on the fight themselves, they've proven to be very successful in what they're doing. What's striking also, Germany. Germany had a very different foreign policy towards Russia, and it was really just literally almost over a weekend. Germany said no go on Nord Stream 2, with a very significant policy move and shift. Germany also agreed to give military armament to the Ukrainian armed forces, which they had refused to do before, and then also significantly said that they are going to contribute their amount to the amount that's, that they had promised, but years later and pledged to give to NATO. That was a major shift, and let me mention just two more. NATO enlargement. Finland, by the news accounts today, Finland is seriously considering joining NATO. It's a very, very striking move on Finland's part. Sweden has also been doing the same in that regard, so there's a shift, and there are a number of other countries that have now expressed a desire and saying we want to be brought into NATO now. Again, I don't think that's the kind of response at all that's been desired by Putin. Last comment on implications. Everyone's been looking at China in this case. China has followed the narrative to a T of Russia. Russia has indicated, do not call this a war or an invasion. It's just an operation. And in this case, China has condoned that. China did abstain from the condemnatory resolution of the United Nations. But I would say that they're trying to walk a line, but when it comes down to which side they're on, they are on the side in supporting Russia. But if Russia fails, I think you're going to see a significant distancing from what's going on, because Russia is cast as a pariah in this case, and they certainly do not want to be cast as a pariah. Right. But China has been put in a very careful and squished position.
Thank you. Well, a lot of global implications. Let's turn to the economic side of the picture and to Dr. Herrera to focus on the impacts here in the heartland. Professor Herrera, can you help us understand the implications of this set of sanctions which have, in this form, never really been tried before? So in some instances, we're really kind of guessing as to what the long-term implications are going to be. But talk to us a little bit about how you see those sanctions playing out and how we'll feel the effects here at home.
So let me answer your question with basically 5 minutes, 4 slides, and going quickly through it with one example. Okay. So the example I want to focus on is the oil sector, because that really matters a lot, not only in terms of the sanctions, but also for the heartland. So just as a background a little bit, we know Russia's production constitutes about 10% of global petroleum production. At the beginning of the invasion, we thought that it would be something about like a drop of 3 million of barrels per day, which would not have been a small drop. We have to remember, however, that lots of the production of Russia is actually consumed inside of Russia. So really, it's only 8% of Russian exports that represent the global petroleum production. There has been oil trickling out still, right? If we look at the satellite data, some of the tankers still have been filling out. An important thing to remember in terms of economic consequences for the heartland is that this oil price shock is very different from what we have seen before, right? Historically, declines in the supply of oil came from destruction of facilities due to military conflict, and we'll remember these pictures from the war in the Persian Gulf. this situation right now has been very different, right? So since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the financial sector has been unwilling to finance, or less willing, let's put it this way, exports from Russia, and then now we have the sanctions too. So when we think about historically, this is very different, probably not exactly like an oil supply shock, but there are fear of sanctions of oil coming from Russia, initially just from the sanctions from the US, but every time we hear more about possible sanctions also coming from the European Union. And we actually saw this huge increase in the rate for the oil tankers coming from Russia. So you may ask, does that matter for the heartland? And the answer would be, if we were going to look at forecasts that the Energy Information Agency was doing about oil prices just last month, if you recall, when we came down with the big shutdown during the COVID pandemic, oil prices started going down when aggregate demand decreased, and they started climbing up afterwards where the economy recovered. But one thing to remember was that investment was down, and exploration and drilling were down. So we cannot respond that quickly to this increase in the price of oil with the release of the petroleum from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and now recently also the International Energy Agency has also said that more oil will be released, really only more is 60 million barrels of oil per day. Prices have started to come down. But if you look at this forecast, if you look at the green lines in the side, what you see is that there's a lot of uncertainty really about what the price of oil will be in the next month or in the next coming year. If, right, we're going to think that the war is going to continue for a while, some of these facilities might be destroyed, and we now have the financial sanctions too, some of this oil might still trickle to China, it might still go to India, and that reduces the effect on the pressure on prices, but there's a lot of uncertainty there, right? Part of it might depend also on what happens in China. We have another shutdown now. We don't know what's going to happen with COVID. Demand might decrease also. So big uncertainty about what is going on. If you think in terms of Kentucky's economy, does that matter? Yes, it matters a lot, right? If we think about GDP by sector of the Kentucky economy, about 23% is the manufacturing sector. And then we ask how many jobs come from that sector and from which sectors do they come, right? So manufacturing employment by sector in Kentucky, if you look at the sectors in red, those are sectors that are very intensive in the use of energy. So if price of energy goes up, the sectors are going to see an increase in the cost of production. They probably are going to shrink employment in the sectors and also output. And possibly more importantly, something that I want you to remember, if you think about Kentucky, about 23% of the employment is generated by the motor vehicle sector, where the price of oil goes up, gasoline prices go up, and then you decide, well, maybe I won't buy the new Cadillac, or I won't buy the new car, or whatever it is, and then you're going to reduce the amount of cars that are going to be demanded, and that reduces the demand for the goods that are produced in Kentucky. So those are the sectors that we should be looking at also on the heartland. Those are the sectors that could be affected by the sanctions if the price of oil goes up, if we have more financial restrictions.
Thank you. Let's broaden it out again and go back to look at the situation specifically in Ukraine and from the diplomatic angle. And I want to get Dr. Farley's take on something that Ambassador Dobrianksy raised, this question of NATO membership and the Ukrainian leadership potentially just ruling out joining NATO, but they have also asked then for some other set of international security guarantees to ensure that this kind of situation wouldn't happen again. How do you see that playing out for the Ukrainians, and what would be the appropriate role of the United States in helping shepherd that?
Well, I think that for any war, the most important question while the war is going on is how does this end, right? And so that's a question of war termination. So how do we get to the end of this war? How do we get to an agreement between Russia and Ukraine that they ought to start fighting? And I think that the ambassador has detailed a lot of the reasons that we shouldn't expect this war to come to an early end, right? And so why the war will go on. A lot of people have talked about some basic conditions that we would expect for peace, right? We would expect that there would be some degree of recognition of Russia's territorial gains in Crimea, some degree of recognition of Russia's territorial gains in the Donbass, and then something about Ukrainian neutrality or Ukrainian demilitarization. And these last two are very twitchy. The territorial questions, I think, are in a lot of ways more tractable than the neutrality and the demilitarization questions because they do involve facts on the ground. With respect to demilitarization, the Russians have asked for a Ukrainian army that would be limited to 50,000. The Ukrainians rightly consider this to be absurd because an army limited to that extent is simply a license for Russia to invade Ukraine whenever it wants to in the future, right? So it's a license for Russia to interfere in the Ukraine at will. And the second question is this neutrality question, right? What does this mean? The problem that the Russians face with respect to Ukrainian neutrality is that Ukraine can declare that it will be neutral in the future, but because this condition is being imposed at the barrel of a Russian gun, no one at all will blame Ukraine if they simply discard any promises that they make at the peace table. Right? And so a year or 6 months after any war ends, if the Ukrainians say, we are no longer feeling insecure, and now we believe we will re-engage with this potential to join NATO, no one in the West is going to blame them for making that decision, right? Because we understand that they were coerced into that concession. And the Russians understand this, right? And they also understand that any security guarantee that is provided by a NATO member, whether it be Turkey or Germany or the United States, is in some way akin to a security guarantee from NATO. And so this is the situation that we find ourselves in, where really what Ukraine and Russia are fighting about is what the next decades of the relationship between the two countries is going to look like. How much influence and how much of a military threat will Russia be able to hold over Kiev in the future? And this is an area in which neither side feels really interested in compromise right now, because the Russians believe that they have a right to this influence, and the Ukrainians absolutely believe that they do not have a right to that level of influence.
Let me just try to ask each of you, before we close, to give up to just 1 minute or less key takeaways for the United States. What have we learned from this, and how should we be thinking about this conflict as we move forward? Let me start with Ambassador Dobrianksy. Do you want to? Is it okay?
I was going to say, why don't we?
Okay, let's go the other way, Dr.
Give them a
Farley.
chance.
I mean, I think that this conflict has shattered our understanding of what the post-war, the post-Cold War liberal international order looked like. We weren't supposed to have wars like this, and that's why the war surprised so many people, despite the fact that Russia telegraphed its intention to invade Ukraine for 6 months. It was still surprising when it happened. A week ahead, I didn't know it was going to happen. I suspected, but I was still surprised a day of. And I think that's the biggest takeaway, that this sort of thing can still happen in the world.
Yeah. Professor Herrera?
Well, I think also that you'd say in terms of economics, that can change also the ground a lot. We don't know sort of the plans that some of the economies had to try to move towards cleaner energy, how these are going to develop. We don't know how the landscape is going to change also in terms of more sanctions. Every single day we have announcements of different sanctions, and this might last for a long period of time.
Thank you. Ambassador.
I think I have a few key takeaways. I happen to work in the Reagan administration, and President Reagan had a slogan, peace through strength. And I think a key takeaway is our preparedness. The investment that we make in our defense clearly matters, and for dealing with a situation like this, because what happens there doesn't only impact just Ukraine and the transatlantic community, but it impacts the United States and our community as well. Secondly, I think that we also need to be looking more closely at what leaders like Putin says, because actually he, in a way, I could argue, previewed this back in 2005 when he made his famous statement about the breakup of the Soviet Union, that it was one of the biggest tragedies of that century. And then in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference, he said, US is a unipolar power, we don't like it, we don't like Western values, and we can intervene anywhere when there are Russians who are in need. Mm-hmm. And so he was teeing up this. We've seen his also invade Ukraine before. So I would say that we need to be prepared, and in some, looking at the end, he cannot get away without impunity.
Thank you. We could easily fill several hours on this topic, but I hope that the conversation today has helped the Concordia audience frame some of the questions and think about some methodologies for analyzing all of what we're seeing today. I know that our thoughts are very much with the people of Ukraine as they endure this very difficult time, and I just want to thank our panelists very much for all the insights you've all shared today. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.